Parade Marshal denies old armor legend entry until Army Chief commands M1 Abrams column to halt. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started with today's incredible story. It's a tale of power, pride, and unexpected respect. The day was crisp, and the sun glinted off the polished M1 Abrams tanks parked in neat rows along the parade route. The air was filled with the chatter of military personnel, the rustle of flags, and the distant sound of marching boots. It was a day for celebration, a day to honor the heroes who had served their country. However, one veteran, one of the true legends of the Armored Division, was about to face an obstacle that would challenge his decades of service and sacrifice. At the entrance to the parade grounds, the parade marshal, a young officer with a sharp uniform and a sharp tongue, stood in the way. The old man, his weathered face bearing the marks of time and countless battles, slowly approached. He was dressed in an old, worn-out tank commander's jacket and faded combat boots. His steps were slow but deliberate. With each movement, he seemed to carry the weight of history itself. As he approached the entrance, the parade marshal's gaze flickered over him with a dismissive sneer. "What do we have here?" the marshal asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Some relic from the past? This is a restricted area. No entry without clearance." The veteran stood tall, unflinching. His eyes, clear and sharp despite his age, met the marshal's with a quiet intensity. "I'm here to pay my respects," he said simply. "I served alongside General Wallace. I was there on the front lines with him." The marshal's face twisted into a grin of disbelief. "General Wallace? Oh sure, and I'm the president. What are you really doing here, old man? This is for active duty personnel only. If you can't provide proper identification, you'll have to leave." The veteran's hands, though gnarled with age, remained steady as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished metal pin, a symbol of the legendary armored unit he had once led. The marshal laughed, inspecting the pin with mock amusement. Is this supposed to impress me?" He waved the pin in the air dismissively. "It's a joke. Maybe you should go home and rest." As the crowd gathered behind him, some chuckled at the old man's expense. But there was something in the veteran's silence that caused a ripple of discomfort among the onlookers. He had seen too much, endured too much to be easily dismissed. With a heavy sigh, he simply stood there, his eyes distant. And then, without warning, the world seemed to change. The marshal's grip on the pin tightened, and as he glanced up to continue his mockery, he froze. A black convoy, with flashing lights and a heavy rumble, appeared on the horizon. The parade grounds fell silent as the lead vehicle, an Army command vehicle, screeched to a halt in front of the gates. The doors opened, and out stepped men in military dress uniforms, their bearing so precise, so commanding that even the hardened soldiers at the gate straightened. And at the front of the group was a man whose presence overshadowed everyone around him. The Army Chief. With 4 stars glinting on his shoulders, his eyes locked on the veteran. Without a word, he stepped forward, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The crowd fell into complete silence. The marshal, still holding the veteran's pin in his hand, was frozen in place. The Army Chief did not acknowledge the parade marshal. Instead, he walked directly up to the old veteran. His voice, deep and filled with authority, echoed across the grounds. "This man," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "is a living legend. You will treat him with the respect he deserves." The marshal's face drained of color as the reality of the situation set in. The Army Chief, with a single command, had reversed everything. The veteran, once dismissed, was now honored. The Army Chief turned to the veteran, his hand raised in a salute that reverberated with the weight of years of service and respect. "It is an honor to have you here, sir," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. The veteran's eyes softened, and he nodded, a faint smile breaking through his stoic expression. The marshal, completely stunned, stood motionless as the parade continued. Now not just a ceremony of military pride, but a moment of true respect for those who had fought, bled, and sacrificed for their country. I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide the continuation of Part 2, following the specifications you requested. The sound of boots marching grew louder as the army chief's presence commanded the entire area. The veteran, once a forgotten relic, now stood at the center of the parade grounds, his heart steady as the weight of the chief's salute still lingered in the air. The onlookers, once skeptical and dismissive, watched in silence as the army chief turned his gaze toward the young parade marshal who had once dismissed the old man. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, but the chief's voice was calm, his words sharp and filled with authority. "You have no idea who you are standing in front of, do you?" he asked, his voice carrying across the now silent grounds. The parade marshal, now visibly uncomfortable, could only stare at the ground. His once proud demeanor had crumbled, replaced with an overwhelming sense of humiliation. He tried to speak, but the chief's next words cut him off completely. "This is Sergeant Major Martin Kelly," the chief said, his words echoing in the minds of everyone who had heard them. "A man whose name is written in the history of this country, a man who has led tank columns into battle, and a man whose service cannot be measured by mere pins or medals." The young parade marshal, still holding the veteran's tarnished pin in his hand, suddenly felt the weight of his disrespect. His fingers trembled slightly as he glanced at the army chief, who was now looking directly at him with a gaze so intense that the marshal could feel the heat of it even from several feet away. "You will not mock him again," the chief said, his voice unwavering. The crowd, once buzzing with the noise of a celebration, was now completely still, every single person waiting for the next move. The army chief turned to the veteran. "Sergeant Major Kelly, if you will, please join us. You've earned your place among us," he said, stepping aside to allow the veteran to move forward. The veteran, who had been silent for the entire ordeal, nodded slowly, his posture still as strong as it had ever been. He took one step forward, and then another, the sound of his boots on the gravel now echoing like a drumbeat. The army chief fell and stepped beside him, their two figures commanding attention as they began to walk toward the front of the parade grounds. The parade marshal, still standing frozen in place, looked around at the sea of faces that were now staring at him, their expressions filled with a mix of awe and disbelief. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The veteran, despite his age and the countless years that had passed since his time in combat, carried himself with the weight of a true hero. The army chief, who had spent his life commanding men, recognized the power of that presence. He was no longer just an old man in a worn jacket. He was a living testament to the sacrifices made by so many like him. As they walked, the veteran's eyes drifted to the tanks parked nearby, their massive turrets gleaming in the sunlight. For a moment, his mind flashed back to the countless battles he had fought, the lives he had saved, and the many soldiers he had led into the heart of war. His fingers twitched slightly, as if reaching for the controls of a tank, the familiar hum of the engines vibrating in his bones. The moment was brief, but it was enough to remind him of who he truly was. He was a legend, a name that would never be forgotten. The parade marshal, still standing at the entrance, was now completely alone. The crowd, once divided, had shifted, their focus entirely on the old veteran and the army chief walking side by side. The tension had evaporated, replaced by a quiet respect that had not been there just moments before. The young parade marshal could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him with an intensity he had never experienced. As he watched the army chief and the veteran approach the front of the parade, he couldn't help but feel a deep, sinking feeling in his stomach. He had been wrong, and now he would have to live with that mistake for the rest of his life. But for the veteran, this was just another day, a day where the respect he had earned was finally acknowledged, a day when the past and the present collided, and the legends of old were given the honor they had long deserved. The M1 Abrams tanks, lined up like silent sentinels, stood as a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who had come before. And as the veteran walked past them, he knew that his place in history was secure. He had led those tanks through hell, and now he would lead them into the future, one last time. I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide the continuation of Part 3, following the specifications you requested. The parade was underway, and the veteran stood tall at the front, his eyes fixed on the procession of M1 Abrams tanks that now rumbled down the street. It had been decades since he had last commanded one of these behemoths in the heat of battle, yet the power, the might, the roar of the engines was all too familiar. As the army chief walked beside him, their presence commanding the attention of everyone around, the crowd's hushed whispers grew louder. They had all witnessed the unexpected turn of events. The old man, once dismissed, was now the centerpiece of the entire event. He had led men into war, and now, with every step he took, he was leading them once again, not into battle, but into a place of honor. The veteran's fingers twitched at his side, the weight of a phantom control stick calling to him. The tanks, lined up like soldiers at attention, were a part of his soul. He had driven them across the battlefield, and now, here, he stood before them once again. The army chief, walking beside him, glanced over at the veteran with a silent understanding. He knew what this moment meant. To anyone else, it might have been a passing moment of respect, but to the old man, this was something far greater. It was a recognition of his lifetime of service, a lifetime of sacrifice that few could truly understand. As they moved through the crowd, the veteran could feel the eyes of every person on him. Some were curious, some were in awe, but all of them were watching with respect. The army chief's presence was undeniable, but it was the veteran's own history that drew them in. For a moment, everything else faded. The crowds, the military vehicles, the sound of the parade, it all blurred into the background. What mattered now was the journey he had taken to get here. He had fought through battles, lost friends, seen horrors that most would never understand. But he had survived, and now, in his final years, he was being acknowledged for the sacrifices he had made. As they approached the main stage, the veteran's steps slowed. His heart, though steady, felt the weight of years pressing down on him. The army chief noticed and gave him a slight nod, as if to acknowledge the toll of time. "You've earned this," the chief said quietly, though the words were enough to be heard over the noise of the parade. The veteran didn't respond. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed forward, eyes straight ahead, focused on the task at hand. The stage was just ahead. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about the duty he had sworn to uphold. They reached the front of the stage, and the army chief stepped forward. The veteran, however, stayed back, as if to take in the moment. As the army chief addressed the crowd, the veteran stood in silence, his posture rigid, as if waiting for something. The crowd was on edge, uncertain of what would come next. The chief's words were powerful, resonating with everyone in attendance. "Today," he said, his voice carrying across the parade grounds, "we honor not just the soldiers who fought for our freedom, but the legends who shaped this army into what it is today." The veteran stood motionless, though inside, the emotions swirled. It wasn't just about the past, it was about the legacy he had left behind. As the army chief continued, the veteran's thoughts drifted once more to the days of battle, to the men he had led, the lives he had saved, and the sacrifices made in the name of honor. He had led his men across the fields of battle, across landscapes torn apart by war, and now, as an old man, he was leading them once again, though this time, it was a victory of a different kind. The chief finished his speech, and the crowd erupted into applause. But the veteran did not raise his hand in a salute. He simply stood, his face unreadable. As the applause washed over him, he was no longer just the man they had dismissed at the gates. He was the legend, the warrior who had given everything for his country. And now, his place was secure. The army chief turned to him, stepping aside. "Sergeant Major Kelly," he said, "the floor is yours." The veteran nodded once, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Slowly, he stepped forward, his boots clicking against the ground with each measured step. The crowd fell silent once again, and for a brief moment, it was as though time had stopped. The veteran took the microphone, his hand steady as he gripped it. His voice, though aged, carried the weight of experience. "I didn't do this alone," he began. "Every victory, every battle, was shared with the men who stood beside me." The crowd waited, hanging on every word. The veteran paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "We fought together, we bled together, and we honored each other. Today, I stand not as a legend, but as one of the many who served this great country, and I am proud to have done so." With those final words, he stepped back, allowing the applause to swell once again. But this time, it wasn't just for the army chief. It was for the man who had fought, who had led, and who had earned his place among the greatest heroes of his time. I apologize for the previous misunderstanding. I will now provide part 4 following your exact specifications. The applause slowly died down as the veteran stepped back from the microphone, his eyes scanning the crowd. He had said what he needed to say, but the weight of the moment was far from over. The crowd, which had once mocked him and turned their backs on him, now saw him for what he truly was, a living testament to the power of sacrifice, honor, and service. As the sound of clapping gradually faded, the veteran's gaze shifted to the line of M1 Abrams tanks sitting just behind the stage. Their massive forms gleamed under the bright lights, silent and imposing. In that moment, the memories came flooding back to him. The days when he was the one in command, the one leading his soldiers into the heart of battle. He could almost hear the roar of the engines, the rumble of the tracks beneath him, and the command of his voice echoing across the battlefield. He had been young once, just like the soldiers who now filled the ranks, brimming with ambition, ready to prove themselves. But the weight of time had taught him more than any battle ever could. It taught him the value of silence, of patience, and of knowing when to lead and when to step back. And now, as he stood there before the very tanks he had once commanded, he realized that the legacy he had left behind was more than just a series of victories. It was the bond he had built with the men and women who had served beside him, the trust they had placed in his leadership, and the respect they had shown him in return. As the veteran's eyes lingered on the tanks, the army chief, who had remained silent beside him, broke the stillness. "It's time," the chief said quietly, his tone calm but filled with a quiet authority. Without a word, the veteran nodded. The time had come to move forward. The crowd began to stir again as the veteran turned to face them, his posture strong, his step steady. He walked toward the M1 Abrams tanks, his eyes never leaving the massive machines. Each tank was a symbol of the power and might of the American military, but to him, they represented something more. They represented the countless battles fought, the lives lost, and the victories earned. The veteran knew that his time as a commander had passed. He was no longer the one giving orders, but his presence still held weight. As he approached the first tank in line, a soldier stepped forward to greet him. The young soldier's face was a mixture of awe and respect, and he offered the veteran a salute. The veteran returned the salute with a slow nod. He knew that the soldier saw him for what he was, a legend, a part of military history. But it wasn't the accolades or the recognition that mattered. It was the duty, the shared bond of service, that connected them. The army chief followed closely behind, his eyes never leaving the veteran. He had seen many leaders in his time, but none had carried themselves with the same quiet dignity, the same unshakable resolve. The chief knew that there was more to this moment than just a symbolic gesture. This was a passing of the torch, a recognition of the sacrifices made by those who had come before. The veteran climbed up into the turret of the M1 Abrams, his movements slow but deliberate. As he settled into the seat, the familiar hum of the engine brought a sense of calm. He had driven these tanks through countless battles, and though his hands trembled slightly from age, the instinct was still there. The army chief watched from below, his gaze unwavering. The veteran, though aged, still commanded the respect of everyone around him. As the veteran turned the key, the M1 Abrams roared to life, the sound echoing through the parade grounds. The crowd fell silent once more, the power of the tank's engine a fitting tribute to the man who had led it into battle. The veteran's hands were steady now as he guided the tank forward, his eyes focused on the path ahead. This was his moment, not as a commander, but as a symbol of everything the military stood for. The army chief gave a small nod of approval as the veteran led the column of tanks down the parade route. The crowd, which had once been filled with skepticism, now watched in awe. They had seen the transformation, the reversal of fate. The old veteran, once dismissed and forgotten, had been given his due. The tanks rumbled forward, their massive forms casting long shadows in the fading light. The veteran's face remained stoic, but inside, a sense of peace settled over him. He had led his men through hell, and now, in his twilight years, he was leading them once again. This time, not into battle, but into the light of respect and honor that had always been his due. The column of tanks moved down the parade route, the veteran at the helm, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the crowd erupted into applause once again. But this time, it wasn't just for the spectacle of military might. It was for the man who had earned his place in history, a man who had fought not for glory, but for the honor of those who had stood beside him. I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide Part 5 according to your exact specifications. As the veteran guided the M1 Abrams down the parade route, the applause from the crowd filled the air, but it was not the loudest sound in his ears. The hum of the tank's engine, the rhythmic clanking of its tracks as they rolled across the pavement, and the weight of the moment. These were the sounds that resonated most deeply within him. This was the moment he had waited for, the recognition he had earned, the respect he had fought for. His grip on the controls was firm, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in memories of battles long past, of soldiers he had led, and of the men who had given everything for the cause. His fingers, though slightly trembling with age, still held the power of command. The tanks ahead of him rumbled forward in perfect synchronization, the roar of their engines a fitting tribute to the strength and might of the armored division. But to the veteran, this was more than just a display of military power. This was a symbol of what he had built, a legacy of sacrifice, courage, and loyalty. The crowd, which had once regarded him as nothing more than an old man with nothing left to offer, now stood in awe. They had witnessed the transformation, the reversal of fate. The legend, the warrior, the hero who had been mocked and dismissed was now being honored. The young soldiers who had stood in the background, watching the veteran's every move, now stood taller, their eyes filled with admiration. They had seen the respect he had earned, the history he carried with him, and the legacy he had left behind. As the veteran's tank passed by, the soldiers saluted, their eyes locked on the man who had led them to victory long before they had ever picked up a weapon. The army chief, walking beside the veteran, took a deep breath. He had seen many leaders in his time, but none had carried themselves with the same quiet dignity and strength as this man. He had fought beside the veteran in his youth, had watched him lead with unwavering resolve, and had always admired the way the veteran had earned the respect of his men, not through titles or medals, but through his actions, his integrity, and his unshakable belief in the mission. The army chief's voice, when it came, was low but filled with respect. "You've done it, old friend," he said, his eyes never leaving the veteran. "You've earned the respect you deserve. Your place in history is secure." The veteran glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "I never did it for the recognition," he replied softly. "I did it for the men who stood with me, for the soldiers who trusted me to lead them, and for those who never made it home." The army chief nodded, understanding. He had heard these words before, had seen the depth of the veteran's humility, but he also knew that this was the moment when the world had finally acknowledged what the veteran had done, what he had given. The M1 Abrams tanks continued their march, their engines roaring as they passed by the crowd. The veteran's gaze was steady, his eyes focused on the path ahead, but his heart was heavy. He thought of the men he had lost, the battles they had fought, and the sacrifices they had made. This was his victory, but it was also their victory. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parade grounds. As the tanks reached the end of the route, the veteran brought the M1 Abrams to a stop. He sat there for a moment, taking in the scene before him. The soldiers, the tanks, the flags fluttering in the wind. This was the end of one chapter, but it wasn't the end of the story. The army chief stepped forward, his face somber but proud. "You've led us well," he said, his voice carrying across the grounds. "Now it's time to pass the torch. But know this, your legacy will never be forgotten." The veteran's gaze softened, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to smile. "I'm not done yet," he said quietly. "There's always more to do." And with that, he stepped out of the M1 Abrams, the crowd parting before him as he made his way to the front of the stage. As he climbed the steps, the silence in the air was palpable. This was the moment when the old warrior, having fought his battles and earned his respect, was finally allowed to rest, not in peace, but in honor. The army chief followed behind, his posture as straight and proud as ever. The applause began to swell once again, this time not for the spectacle of the tanks, but for the man who had made them a symbol of strength and honor. The veteran stood at the front of the stage, his eyes scanning the crowd one last time. He had fought for them, led them, and now he was being honored by them. And as the final notes of the national anthem echoed through the parade grounds, the veteran, standing tall and proud, knew that his place in history was not just secured, it was earned. I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide part 6 following your exact specifications. The sun was beginning to set as the last notes of the national anthem faded into the air, and the applause slowly died down. The veteran stood at the front of the stage, his chest rising and falling with each steady breath. The weight of the moment had not quite settled, but the recognition, the respect, and the honor were there, undeniable and hard-earned. As the crowd began to disperse, the veteran remained where he stood, taking in the scene around him. The M1 Abrams tanks, which had once been his command, now sat silently in their rows, their massive forms looming like sentinels in the fading light. It was surreal to him. How much time had passed, how much had changed. He had once been at the helm of those machines, leading them into the heart of battle, commanding men who had trusted him with their lives. Now, he stood as a symbol of something much greater, of sacrifice, of duty, and of service. But for him, the battle was never really over. His fight had always been about more than just winning wars. It was about preserving the honor and the legacy of those who had come before him, of ensuring that their stories were never forgotten. As the last of the soldiers left the parade grounds, the army chief stepped forward, his face somber but filled with respect. "You've done it," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the now quiet grounds. "The world has seen you for who you are. Your legacy is secure." The veteran nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. He had never done it for the recognition, never done it for the applause. It had always been about something deeper, something more personal. He had led men into the most dangerous places, had faced down the enemy when all seemed lost, and had survived the unthinkable. And in the end, it wasn't about how many battles he won or how many medals he received. It was about the bonds he had forged, the trust he had earned, and the lives he had saved. As the army chief placed a hand on the veteran's shoulder, there was a sense of finality in the air. The parade had ended, the tanks had rolled through the streets, and the crowd had seen the veteran for who he truly was. But the chief knew that for the veteran, this wasn't the end. It was simply a moment of recognition, a brief respite in a long life that had been defined by service. "You'll always be a part of this army," the chief said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "You've shaped us, led us, and now you've shown us what it truly means to serve." The veteran didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The army chief could sense that the veteran was thinking of the past, of the battles, the losses, and the victories. But the chief also knew that the veteran wasn't one for sentimentality. He had never been the type to dwell on the past for too long. Instead, he had always focused on the future, on the next challenge, on the next battle. The chief had learned that lesson from the veteran long ago. As they stood there in silence, the sounds of the evening settled over them. The distant hum of traffic, the chirping of crickets, and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees all seemed to fade into the background. There was nothing left to prove. The veteran had earned his place in history, had earned the respect of everyone who had seen him lead, fight, and sacrifice. But for him, it wasn't the accolades that mattered. It was the quiet moments like this, when he could stand alongside the men and women he had served with, knowing that he had done his duty, that he had given everything for the cause. The chief, sensing the veteran's need for solitude, gave him a final nod before turning and walking away. As the veteran watched him go, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. He had come full circle. The road he had traveled, though long and hard, had led him here, to this moment of recognition, to this moment of respect. And, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parade grounds, the veteran knew that, for the first time in a long while, he could finally rest. Not in peace, but in the knowledge that his legacy was secure, that his sacrifices had been honored, and that the men and women who followed in his footsteps would continue to carry the torch forward. The tanks, the soldiers, and the army he had served would live on, just as he had lived on in their hearts, their memories, and their honor. He could finally let go, knowing that his place in history was more than just a title or a rank. It was the unbreakable bond he had forged with those who had stood beside him. I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide Part 7 following your exact specifications. The veteran stood alone on the parade grounds, the roar of the M1 Abrams engines now fading into the distance. The sun had completely set, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple and orange. The once bustling area was now quiet, the echoes of the ceremony a mere memory. As he stood there, the weight of the day began to settle upon him. The recognition, the applause, it was all overwhelming. But it wasn't what he had fought for. It wasn't what he had given his life to. He had always known that true honor wasn't in the medals, the titles, or the ceremonies. It was in the quiet moments, the times when the work was done and the battles were fought. It was in the soldiers who still remembered, who still carried forward the lessons he had taught them, the bond they had forged in the heat of battle. And now, as he stood there in the silence of the parade grounds, he couldn't help but think of those soldiers. The ones who had never made it home. The ones whose names would never be written in the history books, whose sacrifices would never be celebrated in grand ceremonies. The ones whose families would never get the same recognition, the same respect. The veteran closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the weight of those memories to wash over him. He thought of the young men and women he had led into combat, the ones who had followed him without question, who had trusted him to guide them through the chaos. Many of them had not returned. Their faces flashed before his eyes, and for a brief moment, he felt the sting of their loss as if it had just happened. It never got easier. Time may have passed, but the pain of losing them was a constant companion, a shadow that would always follow him. He opened his eyes and looked out over the parade grounds. The tanks had been parked, their engines turned off, and the soldiers had long since retreated. The only sound now was the faint rustling of the wind as it passed through the trees. It was in moments like this that the veteran felt truly alone, not because he lacked company, but because he knew the weight of what he had lost. He had given everything for his country, for his men, and for the honor of serving. And while he had earned the respect of those around him, the price of that respect had been high. The army chief had said it well earlier, his place in history was secure. But that was the thing about history. It could never truly repay the debt owed to those who had served. No amount of recognition, no amount of applause, could bring back the lives that had been lost, or the pieces of his soul that had been left behind in distant battlefields. He wasn't bitter, not really. He had lived a life of purpose, and he had done what he believed was right. But there were times when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Times when the memories of the past crept up on him and reminded him of the things he had seen, the things he had done. But there was a quiet peace in that as well. He had fought for something greater than himself, and even in the darkest moments, he had never lost sight of that. He had always known that the fight was never about personal glory. It was about protecting the men and women who fought beside him, about ensuring that they would never be forgotten. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would continue to honor their memory. He turned slowly, his steps deliberate as he made his way toward the exit of the parade grounds. The night was settling in, and the lights from the ceremony cast long shadows. Across the pavement, the veteran paused at the gate, taking one last look around. This had been his moment, a moment he had never expected to come. But it wasn't the end of his journey. The battles he had fought, the men he had led, and the legacy he had built were all still with him. And though he would never ask for recognition, he knew that his work was far from over. The world may have changed, but the principles that had guided him throughout his life, duty, honor, and sacrifice, would never waver. As he walked out into the night, the veteran's heart was heavy, but it was also full. Full of memories, full of pride, and full of the knowledge that, in the end, he had lived a life that mattered. And that was enough. I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide Part 8 following your exact specifications. The veteran walked slowly through the quiet streets, the sounds of the parade fading into the distance. The night air was cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the battlefield he had once known. His mind, though weary, was alert, the memories of the day still fresh in his mind. He had never expected this kind of recognition, never expected to be honored in front of so many, to be praised for his years of service. But now that it had happened, he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, a burden he hadn't quite prepared for. As he made his way down the street, he thought back to the faces of the soldiers he had commanded, the the men who had trusted him with their lives. They were the ones he had fought for, the ones who had given everything for the cause. Their faces flashed before his eyes, some smiling, some tired, some lost forever to the violence of war. The veteran's heart ached, as it always did when he thought of them. The soldiers who had died in the line of duty, the ones whose names would never be etched into a plaque, whose stories would never be told. They were the real heroes, not him. He had simply done his job, led his men to the best of his ability. But it was them, their sacrifices, their bravery, that had made the difference. As the veteran continued down the road, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see the army chief walking toward him, his face set in a look of quiet determination. The chief had been with him every step of the way today, from the parade grounds to the recognition ceremony. He had been a constant presence, a symbol of the respect the veteran had earned. "You don't have to walk alone," the army chief said as he caught up to the veteran, matching his pace. "We've got a lot of work to do." The veteran smiled, though it was faint. "I've walked alone for a long time," he replied, his voice soft. "It's just how it is." The army chief shook his head. "Not anymore," he said. "You've earned your place. You've earned the respect of this army. And we're not letting you fade into the past. Your experience, your leadership, it matters." The veteran was silent for a moment, reflecting on the chief's words. For so long, he had been just a ghost, a relic of a time long gone. He had done his duty, fought his battles, and led his men. But what had it all meant? Was it just a job? Or was there something more? The chief's presence beside him was a reminder that, even now, his life had purpose. Even now, he had something to offer. They reached the park at the edge of town, a place the veteran often came to clear his mind. It was quiet here, the sounds of the city muffled by the trees and the distant hum of traffic. The army chief stopped beside a bench and gestured for the veteran to sit. "Take a seat," the chief said. "We've got time to talk." The veteran hesitated for a moment, then nodded and sat down. The weight of the day was finally beginning to settle, the adrenaline of the ceremony starting to fade. He felt tired, but it wasn't the kind of tired that came from physical exertion. It was the exhaustion of the soul, the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. "I've seen a lot of soldiers come and go," the veteran said, his voice distant. "I've led them through hell and back. And some of them never made it out. They gave everything, and I couldn't save them. I couldn't bring them home." The army chief listened quietly, his expression softening. "It's not your fault," he said gently. "You did everything you could. You led them with honor. But war takes its toll. And it leaves scars that never heal." The veteran nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I know, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm still here. I'm still standing, while they're gone. And I can't help but wonder, did I do enough? Did I do enough to honor them?" The army chief placed a hand on the veteran's shoulder. "You did more than enough," he said. "You gave your life to this country. You led with courage, with strength, and with honor. And that's more than most people ever do. You gave everything for them, and for all of us." The veteran looked up, meeting the chief's gaze. There was sincerity in his eyes, a respect that went beyond mere words. It was the kind of respect that could only come from someone who had seen the same horrors, who had fought the same battles. "I guess it's hard to see that sometimes," the veteran said softly. "It's hard to believe it when you've lost so much." The chief nodded. "I understand. But you don't have to carry that burden alone anymore. You've earned your peace. You've earned your place in history. And now, we'll make sure your legacy lives on." The veteran looked out at the darkening sky, the weight of his past settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel a sense of relief, a sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. "I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide Part 9 following your exact specifications." The night had grown quiet as the veteran and the army chief stood side by side, looking out over the parade grounds. The lights from the ceremony were still visible in the distance, but the sounds of the crowd had long since faded. The veteran felt a sense of finality in the air, like the last page of a book had been turned, and now he was left to reflect on what had come before. The world had changed, the army had changed, and so had he. But there was something comforting in that, something reassuring. He had served his time, had given everything for his country, and had earned the respect he now received. But even more than that, He had earned the peace that came with knowing his place in history was secure. The army chief, standing beside him, seemed to sense the same weight of the moment. "It's hard to let go, isn't it?" the chief asked quietly, his voice carrying a hint of understanding. The veteran nodded, his gaze still fixed on the distant lights. "It is," he replied softly. "But I'm not sure I've ever really let go. Not completely. The things we did, the people we lost, you don't forget that." The chief didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, taking in the veteran's words. "I've been where you are," the chief said after a moment, his voice low. "I've stood in the same place, looking back at everything we've done, at everything we've lost. And I've wondered the same things. Did we do enough? Did we make a difference?" The veteran turned his head slightly, glancing at the chief. "And what did you find?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. The chief met his gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of respect and empathy. "I found that the difference we made isn't measured by the battles we won or the medals we earned. It's measured by the people we helped, the lives we touched. It's measured by the legacy we leave behind. Not in the history books, but in the hearts of the men and women we led." The veteran considered the chief's words, letting them settle into his mind. He had always believed that his legacy was defined by the battles he fought, by the victories and losses he had experienced. But maybe the chief was right. Maybe it wasn't the battles that mattered most, but the way he had led those around him, the way he had been there for his soldiers when they needed him most. "You know," the veteran said after a long pause, his voice quieter now, "I never thought about it like that. I always thought that if I just kept fighting, if I just kept pushing forward, that I'd make a difference. But it wasn't always about the fight. It was about the people." The chief nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Exactly," he said. "You made a difference by being the leader they needed, by being the one who stood tall when everything else seemed to fall apart. And that's what they'll remember." The veteran looked out over the parade grounds once again, the weight of the chief's words sinking in. He had always been the one to lead, the one to fight, the one to push through the hardest moments. But now, as he stood here, at the end of his journey, he realized that the true measure of his life wasn't in the battles he had won, but in the men and women who had stood by his side, who had trusted him to lead them. He had given everything for them, and in return, they had given him their respect, their loyalty, and their friendship. And that was the true victory. The veteran took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it didn't matter. He had done his part. He had led with honor, and he had earned the respect of those around him. He had fought his battles, and now it was time to let go. "Thank you," the veteran said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for reminding me of what really matters." The chief gave him a nod, his expression softening. "You earned it," he said simply. "You always have." As the veteran stood there, looking out over the parade grounds, he felt a sense of closure. The battle had been long, the journey hard, but in the end, he had made a difference. He had left a legacy, and that, he realized, was all he could ever ask for. "I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide part 10 following your exact specifications." The night grew deeper, the stars above faintly twinkling as the veteran and the army chief walked side by side in silence. The parade grounds were now empty, the last echoes of the ceremony long gone, leaving only the memories of the day behind. The veteran's steps were slow, but steady, as he made his way toward the small hill that overlooked the military base. From here, he could see the entire layout, the barracks, the training fields, the hangars where the helicopters rested. It was all familiar, a life he had dedicated himself to, a life that had shaped who he was. The army chief walked beside him, his own thoughts seemingly quiet but sharp. It had been a long day for both of them, but for the veteran, it felt like the culmination of a lifetime of service. "You ever think about retiring?" the chief asked, breaking the silence. The veteran glanced at him, surprised at the question. "Retire," he repeated. "I've been retired for years. You know that." The chief gave a small smile. "You know what I mean. Not just from the army, but from the memories. From the weight of it all." The veteran chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't think you ever retire from something like this. It stays with you. It's not the kind of thing you can just walk away from." They reached the top of the hill, and the veteran stopped, his gaze sweeping over the base below. The lights from the barracks cast long shadows, and the distant hum of activity reminded him of the constant motion of the army. Even in the quiet of the night, the work never stopped. "It's strange," the veteran said, his voice low. "I've spent most of my life here, and now, it feels like it's time to move on. But I'm not sure where to go." The chief stood beside him, looking out over the same view. "I get it," he said. "There's no real retirement from a life like this. No place that feels like home after you've given everything to something bigger than yourself." The veteran nodded. "I never did it for the accolades. I never did it for the recognition. But damn it, when you spend your life giving everything, you wonder if it was worth it." The army chief didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his eyes scanning the horizon. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with understanding. Finally, the chief spoke. "You gave everything," he said. "And that's what matters. You fought for your brothers and sisters. You led with everything you had, and that's more than most will ever do. The rest is just noise. The rest is just people trying to make sense of what they didn't live through." The veteran let out a deep breath, his shoulders sinking slightly. "I suppose you're right," he said, but his voice was tinged with something deeper, something that hadn't quite found peace yet. "But sometimes, the weight of it all is too much. You see the faces of the men who didn't make it back, and you wonder if it was worth it." The chief looked at him, his expression softening. "You're not the only one who carries that weight," he said quietly. "We all do. But you're here. You survived. And the men who didn't make it, they live on in the stories we tell, in the lessons we pass on. They're with us, every step of the way. And that's something no one can ever take away from you." The veteran was silent for a moment, reflecting on the chief's words. He had always known that the lives lost in battle were never truly gone. They lived on in the stories, in the memories, in the bonds that couldn't be broken. And while he would never forget the pain of their loss, he realized that their sacrifices had given him something more, something worth fighting for. "I guess it's just hard to let go," the veteran said finally. "Hard to stop looking back." The chief smiled, placing a hand on the veteran's shoulder. "You don't have to let go of everything, just the things that weigh you down. The past is part of who we are, but it doesn't have to define us. You've done your part. Now it's time to rest, to find peace in knowing you gave everything for something greater than yourself." The veteran's gaze softened as he looked out over the base one last time. The army had been his life, his purpose, and now it was time to find something new. It wasn't an easy thing to do, to walk away from a lifetime of service, but he knew the chief was right. The future wasn't defined by the past, and it was time for him to find the next chapter. As they turned to leave, the veteran felt a sense of closure settle over him. The journey had been long, the battles many, but the legacy he had left behind, along with the memories of those who had fought beside him, would live on. And that was enough. As they walked back down the hill toward the quiet of the barracks, the veteran realized that peace wasn't found in the medals, the titles, or the ceremonies. It was found in the quiet moments, the ones where you could finally let go, knowing you had done your duty and made a difference. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to let go and find that peace. "I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide part 11 following your exact specifications." The days following the parade had been quiet, almost too quiet. The veteran had spent most of his time alone, reflecting on the life he had lived, the battles he had fought, and the men he had led. But even in the silence, he felt something inside him shifting, a sense of peace, yes, but also a longing for something more. It wasn't that he missed the chaos of war or the adrenaline of battle. It was the camaraderie, the bond forged in the fire of conflict, that he missed most. He had always been a leader, always had a purpose, and now, with that purpose behind him, he was left to figure out what came next. The quiet nights gave him time to think, but they also made him restless. He couldn't help but feel that, even now, there was more to be done. The world had moved on, but he wasn't ready to let go of the sense of duty that had defined his entire life. One evening, after a particularly long day of reflecting, the veteran received a call from the army chief. His voice, though familiar, sounded different now, almost urgent. "I need you to come with me," the chief said. "There's something that can't wait." The veteran didn't ask questions. He had come to trust the chief completely, and if he needed him, the veteran would go. He grabbed his jacket and left the small apartment he had been staying in, stepping out into the cool night air. The streets were empty, the lights from the nearby buildings casting long shadows. It felt like any other night, but there was a strange tension in the air, as if something big was about to happen. The army chief was waiting for him outside, his face set in a look of determination. "We've got work to do," the chief said, as the veteran climbed into the passenger seat of the waiting vehicle. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. The veteran could sense the weight of the situation, but he didn't press the chief for answers. They would get to it in their own time. After what felt like an eternity, the vehicle pulled into a secluded area on the edge of the base. The veteran recognized the place immediately. It was an old training ground, a place where he had spent countless hours during his younger days. But now, the area was dark, quiet, and almost abandoned. "What's going on here?" the veteran asked, his voice low. The chief looked at him, his expression unreadable. "There's a mission," the chief said, his tone serious. "It's a small operation, but it requires someone with your experience. Someone who's been in the trenches, someone who's led men into battle. We need you." The veteran felt a rush of adrenaline, but he didn't let it show. He had been out of the game for so long, but hearing the chief's words stirred something inside him, something that had been dormant for far too long. "What's the mission?" he asked, his voice steady. The chief took a deep breath, then spoke. "There's a group of soldiers, a team that got cut off during a training exercise. They're stranded, and they need extraction. The problem is, the area's been compromised. There's a chance they've been spotted by the enemy." The veteran's eyes narrowed. "This isn't just a training exercise, is it?" he asked, already suspecting the truth. The chief shook his head. "No, it's real. But we need someone who knows how to navigate hostile terrain, someone who can keep a level head under pressure. That's where you come in." The veteran felt the weight of the responsibility settle over him. It had been years since he had led men into battle, but he knew this was what he had been made for. The world had changed, yes, but the skills he had honed over a lifetime of service were still with him. "I'm in," he said, his voice firm. The chief nodded, then handed him a map and a set of coordinates. "We'll be leaving in an hour," he said. "Get ready." As the veteran looked over the map, his mind raced. The mission was risky, and the stakes were high. But that was what he had lived for, taking risks, making tough decisions, and leading his men through the toughest challenges. He felt the fire inside him rekindle, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly alive. As he prepared for the mission, the veteran couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just another chapter, another opportunity to serve, to lead, and to make a difference. He had spent his life fighting for something bigger than himself, and now, even in his twilight years, he was being called back to do it once more. And as he stood up, ready to face whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure. He was not done yet. "I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide Part 12 following your exact specifications." The veteran sat in the back of the military vehicle, the hum of the engine the only sound between him and the army chief. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the road ahead, but the veteran's mind wasn't on the landscape. It was focused on the mission ahead, on the soldiers who were counting on him to bring them home safely. He hadn't been in a situation like this in years, but the instincts were still there. The old scars, the lessons learned, all came rushing back. His fingers instinctively tightened around the straps of his gear, a feeling that hadn't quite left him. He glanced over at the chief, who was still looking at the map, his face set with the same determination that had led him through countless battles. The chief looked up briefly, meeting the veteran's eyes. "We're about 30 miles out," the chief said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "We'll be in hostile territory. You've done this before, so I'm counting on you to take the lead." The veteran nodded, not needing any further explanation. The terrain ahead was tough, and the risk of enemy interference was high, but this was what he was born to do: lead his men, face the danger, and keep them alive. The weight of leadership was something that had never quite left him, even after all these years. The vehicle continued its steady pace, the road twisting and turning as they moved deeper into the heart of the mission. The tension was palpable, but it was the kind of tension that only heightened the veteran's focus. As they neared their destination, he could already feel the familiar adrenaline building in his chest. The chief glanced back at him one more time. "Ready?" he asked. The veteran's eyes were sharp, his posture rigid as he gave a single nod. Always. They arrived at the drop-off point just as the first hints of dawn began to break on the horizon. The landscape was barren, nothing but rocky terrain and sparse vegetation stretching out before them. The veteran surveyed the area, his trained eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The vehicle slowed to a stop, and the soldiers began to disembark. The veteran didn't waste time. He took the lead, moving with the precision that only years of experience could bring. The soldiers followed him without question, each one falling into formation, ready for whatever came next. The chief was right behind them, but it was clear that the veteran was the one in charge. He led them through the rocky terrain, every step deliberate, every decision calculated. There was no room for mistakes, not with the enemy potentially nearby. The mission was clear: get in, extract the soldiers, and get out without a trace. But nothing ever went as planned. As they neared the location, the veteran signaled for the team to halt. His hand went up, a silent command, and everyone froze in place. The faint sound of movement carried on the wind. Someone was out there. The veteran motioned for a few soldiers to spread out, their movements quick and silent. He knew the enemy was close. He could feel it. The tension in the air grew heavier. The wind howled through the rocky hills, and every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. But the veteran stayed calm, his breathing steady, his mind focused on the task at hand. He had led men through far worse, and he wasn't about to let fear take hold now. Suddenly, a distant shout broke the silence. The veteran's head snapped in the direction of the noise, his senses fully alert. The enemy was closing in. He signaled the team to move, quickly and quietly. The soldiers began to spread out, using the terrain to their advantage, taking cover behind boulders and trees. The veteran led the way, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of the soldiers they had come to rescue. The chief followed closely behind, his hand resting on the sidearm at his hip. They were close now. Too close. The veteran's heart raced as he moved forward, his instincts kicking in. He knew the mission was getting dangerous, but it was too late to turn back now. He pushed on, trusting in his training, trusting in the soldiers beside him. As they reached the edge of the enemy's territory, the veteran spotted the small group of soldiers huddled together, their faces tense but relieved when they saw the rescue team. The veteran didn't waste time with words. He pointed to the exit route and motioned for the soldiers to follow. "Move," he commanded, his voice steady. The soldiers fell into line, moving quickly but cautiously as they began the journey back to safety. The enemy, it seemed, was already aware of their presence. Gunfire erupted from behind them, and the veteran's instincts kicked into high gear. "Keep moving," he shouted, as he spun around, returning fire. The soldiers behind him did the same, their shots precise, hitting their targets as they moved. The veteran's mind was racing. This wasn't part of the plan, but he had faced this kind of chaos before. He knew how to lead his men through it. The gunfire grew louder, but the veteran didn't flinch. He had been in worse situations, and this time would be no different. He kept his focus, guiding his team through the firefight, moving with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. And as they reached the extraction point, the veteran allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The mission wasn't over yet, but the first step was complete. They had completed the rescue. The soldiers were safe. For now, that was enough. I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide Part 13 following your exact specifications. The mission was complete. The soldiers were safely extracted, and the veteran, with the army chief by his side, stood overlooking the horizon. The night was still, the air cool and crisp. The chaos of battle was behind them now, but the weight of it still lingered in the veteran's chest. He had always known that the work was never truly done, that there would always be another challenge, another mission. But tonight, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The adrenaline from the firefight had worn off, and the adrenaline of being in charge had faded as well. He was left with the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done his part. He had led the soldiers through danger, kept them alive, and brought them home. That was all he could ever ask for. The army chief stood beside him, watching as the last of the vehicles pulled away from the extraction point. "You did good," the chief said, his voice quiet but filled with respect. The veteran nodded, not needing to say anything in response. The mission had been dangerous, but they had made it through, together. They had saved lives, completed the mission, and come out on top. That was enough for him. As they made their way back to the vehicle, the veteran's mind drifted to the soldiers he had served with, to the ones who had made it through and the ones who hadn't. He thought of the men who had died beside him, of the ones who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Their faces flashed before his eyes. Some were soldiers he had led, some were friends, and others were strangers who had fought under his command. But all of them had one thing in common. They had given everything for the cause. The veteran didn't know if he would ever fully come to terms with the weight of that. The lives lost, the battles fought, the endless years spent in service. He had done his duty, but sometimes it felt like it wasn't enough. It wasn't the deaths of the men that weighed on him. It was the moments he hadn't been able to save them. It was the faces he couldn't bring back, the promises he couldn't keep. But that was the price of leadership, and it was a price he had willingly paid. "You all right?" the army chief asked, breaking the veteran from his thoughts. The veteran looked over at him, nodding slowly. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "Just thinking." The chief gave him a knowing look. "You've earned a break, you know. You've done more than enough." The veteran chuckled softly. "I've never been one to take breaks," he said. "But I guess I could use one. Maybe just a little rest." The chief smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good," he said. "Then let's get back to base. You've earned it." They climbed into the vehicle, and as it drove back to the base, the veteran allowed himself to relax just a little. The mission had been a success, and while there would always be more work to do, more battles to fight, tonight he had done what he came to do. He had led his men, saved lives, and kept his promise. The rest, he realized, was out of his hands. As the vehicle made its way back to the base, the veteran thought about what the chief had said. Maybe he had done enough. Maybe it was time to let go, to step back and let others take the reins. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to entertain the idea. Perhaps it was time for him to rest, to find a new purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, but that was all right. He had lived a life filled with purpose, a life of service, and he could look back knowing that he had made a difference. When they arrived back at the base, the veteran stepped out of the vehicle, taking in the familiar surroundings. The base was still, but he could sense the buzz of activity in the distance. He had seen it all before: soldiers training, vehicles rolling out, preparations for the next mission. But tonight, the veteran felt something different. He wasn't just a part of the machine anymore. He had been part of something much bigger, something that transcended duty and medals. He had been part of a brotherhood. And as he walked back toward the barracks, the veteran realized that, while his time on the front lines might be over, his legacy would live on in the soldiers he had led, in the lives he had touched. And that, he knew, was enough. "I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I will now provide the SEO-optimized description following your exact specifications." In this emotional story, a veteran reflects on his past, his battles, and the legacy of service he leaves behind. After years of serving his country, he faces the challenge of letting go and finding peace. This emotional story delves deep into the heart of sacrifice, leadership, and the lasting impact one man can have on those around him. The veteran's journey is filled with moments of self-doubt, reflection, and, ultimately, understanding. As he navigates through memories of the men he lost and the missions he completed, this emotional story highlights the bond forged in the fire of combat and the true meaning of service. With every step, the veteran is reminded that his duty goes beyond medals and recognition. It's about the lives he saved and the comrades he led. This emotional story isn't just about war. It's about the human spirit, resilience, and the silent battles fought long after the uniforms come off. As the veteran comes to terms with his past and his place in the world, his story is a testament to the power of remembering, honoring, and continuing to serve. This emotional story shows that no matter the circumstances, the courage to lead, the strength to endure, and the ability to find peace are what define a true hero.